Hello, what is dialectics? Now, dialectics is a process that has been used for a very long time, but to start with the definition, dialectics is a way of reasoning, arguing, and understanding reality by looking at opposite or contradictory ideas. So, you have one idea, and then you have an opposing idea to that idea, and then you have the synthesis of those two ideas. So, today we're going to talk about dialectics, how it came about, the history of it, and how it can be applied to you today, and how we're going to apply it when we do the next video about history. So, where did dialectics start? Of course, as with everything, it started in Greek philosophy with Socrates. And what Socrates would do is he would use dialectics to show the contradictory logic in somebody's statement. Socrates, whose method involved a series of questions designed to expose contradiction in a person's belief. Socrates did not typically offer direct answers, but guided his students to discover their own inconsistencies, thereby clearing the ground for genuine knowledge. So, for example, Socrates asked Euthyphro in the Republic, "What is pious?" And Euthyphro responds, "What is dear to the gods is pious, and what is not dear to the god is impious." So, Socrates says, okay, well, the gods disagree on what is pious and what is impious, right? And Euthyphro has to agree because they don't agree. So Socrates answers, you cannot be pious and impious at the same time. Therefore, there is a contradiction in your statement. And Socrates used this as a form of logic in order for people to figure out the contradictions in their statements. Now, of course, that's the ancient use of it, which we would say applies more to logic. But when you get towards the modern age, you will see that it starts to be used more in a metaphysical sense, starting with Immanuel Kant. Kant actually describes something called transcendental dialectics, and what he is talking about is saying that you cannot use reason beyond the phenomena. And if you remember our conversations about phenomena and noumena, phenomena is the reality that we can only perceive through our senses, versus the noumena, which is the actual real world that we cannot perceive through our senses. So Kant says that because there is a wall between the phenomena and the noumena, you have a dialectic there because you cannot access the noumena. It's another way of saying you cannot access the infinite from the finite. The next person who describes dialectics is Hegel, and Hegel actually disagrees with Kant here. He believes that there is no noumena realm and that we're actually accessing this so-called noumena, or the real world, through the process of dialectics. Kant's mistake then was that he regarded reason or rationality as only in our heads. Hegel suggests rather than in both of us and the world itself. We can use our reason to have knowledge of the world because the very same reason that is in us is in the world itself as its own defining principle. The rationality or reason in the world makes reality understandable, and that is why we can have knowledge of or understand reality with our rationality. Dialectics, which is Hegel's account of reason, characterizes not only logic but also everything true in general. So essentially here Hegel is saying that you can access the actual world through the dialectical process, through the idea and then contradiction of that idea and negation of that idea. So with Hegel, because of this dialectical process, you get an unfolding of history. Now, of course, we have to get to the next dialectical thinker, who is Marx. And Marx really liked Hegel for this dialectical process, but he didn't like the idealism of it. He wanted it more grounded in a material process, so he creates dialectical materialism. And what Marx says is that history progresses through the dialectics, or the internal contradictions between your productive forces and your relations of production. And we will describe what all of that means next time. So next time we're going to do a historical analysis through a Hegelian lens and through a Marxist lens to see how history progressed through both of these ideas. So, let's talk about why is dialectics important and what kind of logical method is it, right? It's not just a regular deductive or inductive response, it's a way of making logical analysis on something so that any kind of contradictory ideas don't get left out in the process. At its core, dialectic is a method of philosophical argument that involves some sort of contradictory process between opposing sides. It's not just a debate, it's a structured exchange of ideas, questions, and arguments aiming to uncover truths that might be obscured by initial assumptions or partial perspectives. So you can see that dialectics is really helpful in your life for seeing a opposing a perspective and seeing if your logic still holds through. So, for example, something like DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which was created by someone named Marcia Linehan in the 1970s, can be used to solve very intense emotional problems. DBT is a type of talk therapy based on CBT, but it's specifically adapted for people who experience emotions very intensely. DBT focuses on helping people accept the reality of their lives and their behaviors, as well as helping them learn to change their lives, including their unhelpful behaviors. Okay, so say you did something wrong, and now you believe that you're a failure because of that. The complete opposite of being a failure would be being very successful, right? So you say, I am successful, but that you don't quite believe that, right? Because that doesn't make sense. If I did something wrong, I should feel like a failure, right? So you take a synthesis of that, right? You say, okay, I failed at this one thing, but that doesn't mean I'm overall a failure. It's taking these two extremes and finding some sort of synthesis with it. And that way your beliefs aren't as extreme and you can find some kind of synthesis or middle ground with the belief system that you have. So, next time, as I said before, we are going to do an analysis of history through a Hegelian lens and through a Marxist lens to see how the dialectical process can help us in terms of history. I'll see you then.